We send kids to school to prepare them for the future. But what if the very system designed to empower them is actually limiting them? What if education, the great equalizer, the supposed playground of imagination, is quietly training children to conform, obey, and repeat rather than think, question, and create? Here's a paradox worth your attention. Why do children, naturally curious and wildly creative, often lose that spark the longer they stay in school? Why do students graduate knowing how to take tests, but not how to solve real problems or navigate life? We're told that education is the path to freedom, but what if it's become a factory for compliant workers, not liberated minds? In this video, we'll unravel that question. With help from radical thinkers like John Dewey and Ivan Illich, we'll examine whether we're teaching kids to live or just to survive the system. Spoiler alert, your diploma may not mean what you think it does. John Dewey and the education as experience ideal. John Dewey wasn't trying to create a utopia. He wasn't selling a dream where every child becomes a genius. What he offered was far more grounded and perhaps more dangerous to the status quo. He said quite simply that education is not preparation for life. It is life. And in saying that, he challenged everything about how modern schooling functions. Because if school is life, then it should feel alive, not like a waiting room for adulthood, not like an assembly line. To Dewey, learning wasn't about memorizing abstract content from a chalkboard. It was about experience, real, lived, messy, participatory experience. He believed that humans don't learn in isolation, but through doing, through experimenting, through interacting with the world around them. The classroom wasn't supposed to be a bubble that simulates life. It was life, a laboratory where ideas collided with action and theory met reality. But walk into most classrooms today and you'll see a very different story. Students seated in rows, facing forward, following instructions, not asking too many questions. Information flows in one direction, and the student's job is simple: absorb, regurgitate, repeat. Here's the irony. Dewey was writing about this problem over 100 years ago. He saw it coming. He warned that if education became too focused on static knowledge, on content divorced from context, it would kill the natural curiosity of students. He feared that schools would become training centers, producing efficient workers instead of thoughtful citizens. And yet, here we are. Our education system is built on standardization. Everyone learns the same thing, in the same way, at the same age, regardless of interest, context, or need. Why? Because it's efficient. Because it fits the model of industrialization, where schools feed the workforce, just like machines feed production lines. But Dewey wasn't nostalgic or anti-progress. He wasn't calling for kids to run through the woods and discover themselves in some romantic pre-modern way. He wanted structure, but the kind of structure that grows with the student, not against them. He believed in guided learning, where teachers were not authoritarian figures but facilitators. In Dewey's vision, a teacher's job wasn't to deposit knowledge like a bank transaction. It was to nurture the student's ability to ask better questions, to reflect, to engage, to explore. In short, the teacher wasn't the center of the classroom. The experience was. That's where Dewey really differs from how we typically see education today. Modern schooling is obsessed with outcomes, test scores, grades, certificates. But Dewey didn't see knowledge as a product. He saw it as a process. He believed that what mattered most wasn't whether you could memorize the dates of World War I, but whether you could understand what war meant and why it matters. He didn't want students to just know information. He wanted them to connect it to their lives, to their communities, to the ethical, emotional, and social dimensions of being human. Unfortunately, our current model is built for efficiency, not depth. Schools today often prioritize coverage over comprehension. The goal is to finish the curriculum, not necessarily to ensure it made any sense to the kids. We measure performance in numbers, we chase data, but Dewey would ask, did the student grow? Did they develop as a person? Did they become more curious, more capable of thinking for themselves? Those are harder questions. They don't fit neatly on a spreadsheet. They don't scale well, but they're the ones that actually matter. Dewey also challenged the idea that learning only happens in school. He argued that education doesn't stop when the bell rings. Life itself is an ongoing curriculum. Every encounter, every challenge, every failure is a chance to learn, if we treat it that way. But when we compartmentalize learning into a 9 to 3, Monday to Friday routine, we send the message that education is something done to you, not something you do. That knowledge is stored in books and buildings, not lived in relationships, conversations, and experiences. And here's where the damage shows. Students don't leave school more curious. They often leave more passive. Conditioned to wait for permission, afraid of failure, focused more on what the system wants than what truly interests them. They've been trained to succeed in school, but not necessarily in life. Dewey wanted the opposite. He wanted learning to mirror life in all its unpredictability. He wanted students to engage with real-world problems, to think critically, to work collaboratively, not because it would look good on a resume, but because that's how human beings actually grow. Let's not forget, Dewey wasn't anti-knowledge. He wasn't against facts or logic or structure. What he was against was isolation, knowledge divorced from life. He believed that education should be rooted in the world students actually live in, that it should be relevant, responsive, and real, not in the sense of being fun or trendy, but in the sense of being meaningful. So here's the takeaway. Dewey didn't want to burn down the schoolhouse. He wanted to rebuild it, brick by brick, with curiosity as the foundation. He saw students as active participants in their own growth, not empty containers to be filled. He believed in democracy not just as a political idea, but as a way of learning. A classroom to him was a small society, and how we educate is how we shape the citizens of that society. If we train them to obey, they'll obey. If we teach them to ask, they'll ask. If we give them space to create, to fail, to reflect, they'll develop the inner resources to live, not just make a living. And maybe that's the question we should all be asking. Are we educating people to pass tests or to live well? Ivan Illich and the Deschooling Society. If John Dewey gently invited us to rethink education, Ivan Illich kicked the door in and said, "Burn it down." Illich didn't want to reform the education system. He wanted to abolish it. Not because he hated learning, but because he loved it too much to watch it be strangled by schooling. In his 1971 manifesto, Deschooling Society, Illich made a radical claim. Institutional education doesn't empower people, it disempowers them. And not in obvious ways. Schools don't yell at you to stop thinking. They do something far more clever. They convince you that real learning only happens with certified teachers, inside buildings with bells, and only if it's measured with a grade. Illich believed that this model creates intellectual dependency. We stop trusting our own ability to learn through curiosity, experience, trial and error. Instead, we wait for the next course, the next lecture, the next curriculum. We hand over the keys to our minds and say, "Tell me what's worth knowing." In Illich's view, that's not education, it's training. Not for life, but for systems. Not for growth, but for obedience. He saw schools as places that manufacture the belief that knowledge is scarce, that expertise is always external, and that learning is something that needs to be authorized. And what happens when learning gets institutionalized? It gets filtered through bureaucracy, hierarchy, and standardization. Creativity becomes extra credit. Curiosity becomes disruptive. Questions that don't lead to testable answers, they get quietly ignored. The school system, Illich argued, doesn't just teach subjects, it teaches submission. You learn to wait for permission, to seek approval, to fear mistakes. You learn that success is a grade, not an insight. And worst of all, you learn that your worth is something someone else evaluates. Illich saw this as a form of cultural poverty. In a truly free society, people would learn from their environment, their communities, their peers. They would pursue knowledge the same way they pursue food or friendship, naturally, openly, and without shame. But schools take that organic hunger for understanding and put it in a uniform. They tell you when to speak, what to read, how to interpret, and then they give you a certificate that says, "Congratulations, you followed the rules." Of course, Illich's ideas were controversial, and still are. Suggesting that schools might be harmful sounds offensive to the modern ear. But let's pause and really consider his point. Illich wasn't saying that learning is bad. He was saying that compulsory schooling, as it exists today, is deeply flawed. It alienates learners from the learning process. It creates a caste system of the educated and the uneducated. It pretends to be a great equalizer. But in practice, it often reproduces inequality. The privileged go to better schools with better resources and graduate with better credentials, which justifies their privilege all over again. Meanwhile, those who struggle in the system are labeled underachievers, regardless of their creativity or real-world intelligence. Illich imagined something different, a society where learning is decentralized, voluntary, and self-directed, where people could access networks of knowledge through mentors, peers, and practical experiences without needing to enroll in a rigid institution. He proposed learning webs, where you could connect with others who shared your interests and exchange skills in meaningful, real-world contexts. Imagine if the internet had been designed not to feed you ads, but to connect curious minds across geography and background, purely to learn. That's what Illich was dreaming of. And in some ways, we're closer to that now than he could have imagined. Online learning, community forums, open source education, all reflect a piece of his vision. But the school system? It remains largely untouched, still obsessed with credentials, still enforcing attendance, still pretending that tests measure wisdom. Illich also challenged the myth of school as liberation. We're told that education is the path out of poverty, the ladder to success. But Illich warned that this belief is dangerous, not because education can't be transformative, but because when the system becomes the only recognized path, everyone who doesn't fit it is marginalized. Think about that for a moment. A child who learns better by building things, who questions authority, who struggles with reading but excels in hands-on projects, this child isn't nurtured by the system. They're labeled, remediated, sometimes even medicated, and all because they don't match the mold. In Illich's words, school makes alienation preparatory to life. That's a fancy way of saying school teaches you to be disconnected from your own learning instincts, just in time to enter a job market that doesn't care what drives you, only how well you perform. So what do we do with this? Do we quit our jobs and unschool the nation? Probably not overnight. Illich wasn't offering a blueprint, he was sounding an alarm. He was asking us to stop treating school as a sacred cow, to remember that education doesn't have to be institutional to be real, that we can learn in gardens, in workshops, in conversations, in failures. That teaching doesn't require a degree, it requires empathy and curiosity. Illich's critique hurts because it hits a nerve. Deep down, many of us know the system didn't teach us how to live. It taught us how to comply. We learned how to show up, follow instructions, please authority. But did we learn how to think, how to listen, how to find meaning in the mess of being alive? The tragedy isn't just what schools fail to teach, it's what they actively unteach: initiative, wonder, autonomy. And the solution isn't necessarily to eliminate school, but to radically reimagine it. Not as a pipeline, but as a playground. Not as a hierarchy, but as a web. Not as a test of obedience, but as an invitation to explore. Illich didn't hate education. He hated the idea that education had been turned into a tool of control. He believed that every human being, regardless of age or background, has the right to learn in their own way, at their own pace, driven by their own questions. And maybe, just maybe, he was right. Learning to work versus learning to live. What's the point of education? No, seriously. Beyond the slogans, the speeches, and the mission statements, what are we really teaching people to do? If we look at the structure, the pace, the incentives, and the outcomes, the answer is clear. We're teaching people to work. Not to think, not to live, not to ask why. We're teaching them to show up, follow instructions, meet deadlines, and produce measurable results. The modern school system isn't a temple of wisdom. It's a training ground, a soft, polite rehearsal for the adult workplace. From the first day of kindergarten, the process begins. Line up, sit still, raise your hand, do what's asked, even if it doesn't make sense. Complete your tasks, regardless of whether they interest you. Learn the difference between the right answers and everything else. Oh, and don't forget to compete with your classmates, with the national average, with some imaginary standard of excellence. All of this, we're told, is for our own good. It builds character. It prepares us for the real world. But here's the problem. What if the real world we're preparing students for is broken? What if success in school simply means adapting to dysfunction, learning how to tolerate boredom, accept hierarchy, suppress individuality, and conform to expectations? What if learning to work means learning to be replaceable, efficient, predictable, manageable? We've created a system where success is defined by productivity, not purpose, where the endpoint of education is a job, not a life well lived. This isn't just a philosophical issue, it's practical. Most people spend over a decade in school, and by the end, many of them can calculate the area of a trapezoid but have no idea how to handle failure, build meaningful relationships, or find purpose in their lives. They know how to pass tests, but not how to cope with anxiety. They can write essays, but not express themselves honestly. They can meet expectations, but they don't know what they actually want. In short, they're trained, but not educated. It's the difference between being functional and being fulfilled, between surviving and living. And it's not like we don't notice. The rise of burnout, anxiety, and disillusionment among young adults isn't a coincidence. It's not just a mental health issue, it's a meaning issue. We've handed people a manual for economic survival, but we've skipped the chapters on existential navigation. We've taught them how to write resumes, but not how to wrestle with doubt. We've prepared them for performance, but not for introspection. They know how to work, but they don't know how to live. The philosopher Alan Watts once said, "You are a function of what the whole universe is doing in the same way that a wave is a function of the ocean." Beautiful, right? But imagine trying to fit that into a standardized curriculum. It doesn't test well. It doesn't prepare you for a quarterly review. And that's the point. Living well, really living, isn't quantifiable. It doesn't fit into a rubric. But that doesn't mean it's less important. It means it's harder to institutionalize, and so we ignore it. John Dewey, remember him? He tried to warn us. He believed education should cultivate the whole person, not just the productive worker. He wanted students to grow emotionally, socially, ethically, not just intellectually. Education, to Dewey, was a preparation for democracy, for community, for engaged living. But in practice, we turned it into preparation for job markets, corporate ladders, and lifelong performance anxiety. And then there's the other kind of learning, the kind that happens outside classrooms, without supervision. The kind that emerges from curiosity, play, failure, reflection. Learning how to care for a dying parent. Learning how to forgive someone who hurt you. Learning how to fail with dignity or succeed without arrogance. This is the kind of education that rarely shows up in transcripts, but defines who you become. It teaches you not how to make a living, but how to make a life. But here's the problem. We don't take that kind of learning seriously. We call it soft skills or life experience, as if it's somehow inferior. Meanwhile, the hard skills, the ones that can be tested, measured, monetized, get all the attention. The result? A generation of highly trained workers who don't know how to deal with being human, and a society that rewards productivity while quietly starving its soul. Now, this isn't an argument against hard skills. Knowing how to code, calculate, or build things is valuable. But it's not enough. A society of experts without introspection, compassion, or purpose is a society teetering on the edge of collapse. We need both. We need minds that can build systems and hearts that can question whether those systems are worth building in the first place. So what's the alternative? Do we stop teaching job skills? No, but we stop pretending they're the only skills that matter. We start valuing emotional literacy, ethical reasoning, creative risk-taking. We reframe success, not as compliance, but as conscious engagement. We teach students not just how to fit in, but how to ask, what kind of world do I want to help create? We stop asking kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? And start asking, what kind of life do you want to live? Because one leads to a job title, the other leads to reflection, exploration, possibility. One teaches you how to adapt to the system. The other gives you the courage to change it. In the end, it comes down to this. Do we want schools that produce workers or humans? Do we want to fill jobs or shape lives? Because if we don't teach people how to live, someone else will. And chances are it'll be a system that values profit over people, obedience over insight, survival over joy. And that right there is the difference between learning to work and learning to live. Creativity, conditioned out of us, creativity is a natural human instinct. You don't have to teach a child how to imagine. They already do it, constantly. They turn spoons into airplanes, clouds into dragons, questions into entire worlds. It's not a skill they acquire. It's the way their minds move before we train them otherwise. The tragedy is not that children lack creativity. The tragedy is that most of them lose it, and often in the one place meant to nurture it, school. Now, no teacher stands at the front of a classroom and announces, "Today we're going to kill your imagination." That would be too obvious. What happens is quieter, subtler, a slow process of domestication. It begins when answers become more important than questions, when coloring outside the lines earns a red mark, when being curious is seen as being distracted, when a wrong answer brings embarrassment instead of exploration. And before long, that vibrant mental world full of possibilities gets replaced with a dull fixation on being correct, being fast, being approved of. The system doesn't hate creativity. It just doesn't know what to do with it. Creativity is unpredictable. It doesn't follow rubrics. It resists being timed, graded, or scheduled into a 40-minute block between algebra and history. It tends to ask inconvenient questions like, "Why are we doing this?" Or "What if we tried something completely different?" And systems, especially ones built for standardization, do not like being questioned. So creativity gets sidelined, labeled as a gifted track, siloed into arts electives, or worse, tolerated only if it produces something impressive and award-worthy. Be creative, the system says, but make sure it fits the curriculum. But real creativity doesn't care about neat results. It's messy, inefficient, and often looks like failure before it looks like anything else. It requires space to wander, to play, to try and fall and try again. It grows best where there's room to breathe, not when everything is tied to performance. And here's the cruel irony. The more we treat creativity as something to be measured, the more we strangle it. When every drawing gets graded, when every idea must align with learning objectives, students quickly learn to stop taking risks. They learn that safety is better than originality, that fitting in is better than standing out. This conditioning works. By the time most students reach adolescence, they've internalized it. They hesitate to speak up unless they're sure of the answer. They avoid unusual ideas in fear of getting it wrong. They edit themselves, not because anyone told them to, but because the system trained them to. They become efficient, well-behaved, high-achieving, and quietly disconnected from their own creative instincts. The system doesn't call this damage, it calls it discipline. And let's be clear, this isn't the fault of teachers. Many of them are creative, passionate, and aching to do more. But they're often stuck inside a machine that demands measurable outcomes, standardized tests, and classroom management over inspiration. You can't cultivate wonder when the pressure is to raise test scores. You can't foster risk-taking when your students are terrified of failure. So even the most well-meaning educators end up prioritizing control over curiosity, not because they want to, but because the system makes them. Let's take a step back. Why is creativity even important? Is it just about painting or music or writing poetry? No. It's the foundation of all problem-solving, all innovation, all empathy. Creativity allows us to imagine perspectives we've never lived, futures we've never seen, solutions we've never tried. It's how we adapt, grow, evolve. Without it, we don't just lose artists. We lose thinkers, healers, leaders. But creativity doesn't thrive in environments of fear. It needs freedom. It needs the possibility of failure without shame. It needs permission to be weird, to be different, to explore ideas that don't immediately make sense. And perhaps most of all, it needs time. Time to reflect, time to be bored, time to make connections that standardized tests can't measure. Of course, none of this fits well into a school system modeled after industrial production. Factories like order. Creativity likes chaos. Factories need predictable output. Creativity demands flexibility. And yet, we still try to fit creativity into a structure that's fundamentally opposed to it. We decorate classrooms with motivational posters about thinking outside the box, while making sure students never leave the box. We host creativity days, then return to rigid schedules. We teach students to dream big, right after we penalize them for coloring the sun purple. The result? Adults who struggle to think for themselves, who wait for permission before acting, who see problems but don't believe they can offer solutions. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they've been trained to doubt their own originality. They've been taught that someone else knows better, that creativity is a luxury, not a necessity. But what if we flipped the script? What if we treated creativity as the core of learning, not the decoration around it? What if schools were places where imagination wasn't just allowed but expected? Where the question, "What do you think?" mattered more than, "What's the right answer?" Where students were rewarded not for getting it perfect, but for trying something new. It would require trust. It would require letting go of rigid metrics and embracing a little uncertainty. But the payoff would be enormous. People who aren't just technically skilled, but deeply imaginative. Not just productive, but inventive. Not just employable, but alive. Creativity isn't something you add into a system after everything else is done. It's not an extra. It's the heart of what makes us human. And if we keep designing schools that filter it out, we shouldn't be surprised when our societies become efficient, but empty. The hidden curriculum. Obey, don't question. Not everything we learn in school is written on the whiteboard. Some lessons are quieter. They're not in textbooks, not part of any official curriculum, but they shape us just the same, sometimes more deeply. Sociologists call it the hidden curriculum, and it teaches one core idea, over and over: conform. Sure, you go to school to learn math, literature, science, but you also learn something else. How to sit still even when you're restless, how to keep quiet even when you disagree, how to wait for permission to speak, move, eat, go to the bathroom. You learn that authority is not to be questioned, that performance is more important than process, that fitting in is safer than standing out. You learn to follow instructions even when they don't make sense, because that's the rule. And here's the thing: none of this is accidental. The school system, as it exists today, was designed during the rise of industrialization. The goal wasn't to nurture free thinkers. It was to create obedient, punctual, trainable workers for factories and bureaucracies. The structure of school mirrors the structure of the workplace. Bells signal your movements, authority figures monitor your behavior, your day is broken into timed tasks. You're rewarded for compliance, punished for resistance. In other words, schools don't just prepare you for a job, they train you to need the system. And yet we call this discipline. We tell ourselves it's good for children, it teaches order, it builds character. But what kind of character are we actually building when we teach young people that obedience is more valuable than originality? That rules matter more than reason? That silence is a virtue? This conditioning doesn't stop at graduation. It bleeds into adult life. It's why people tolerate soul-crushing jobs without speaking up. Why so many feel discomfort when someone asks a difficult question at a meeting. Why we self-censor even in casual conversations. We've internalized the idea that rocking the boat is dangerous, that being agreeable is safer than being honest. Let's be clear, rules aren't inherently bad. Structure isn't the enemy. Societies need some form of order, but order without critical thought becomes control. And schools that emphasize order above all else are not educating, they're programming. This hidden curriculum teaches a very particular worldview. There is a system. The system knows best. Your job is to play your part. It's subtle, but powerful. Students learn that their value is defined by how well they follow instructions and how few mistakes they make. That their future depends on pleasing invisible authorities, whether they agree with them or not. That success means learning how to play the game, not how to question the rules. And if you do question the rules, you're a problem, a distraction, a rebel. Not curious but disruptive, not thoughtful but difficult. And once that label sticks, it's hard to shake. Many students learn early that compliance is rewarded and dissent is punished, not with whips or chains, but with low grades, side eyes, and quiet exclusion. This isn't education, it's quiet suppression dressed up as responsibility. Even creativity is tolerated only within a narrow frame. A poem that challenges authority, too political. A question about the grading system, inappropriate. A perspective that doesn't fit the syllabus, off topic. So what do students learn? To play it safe. To give the answer that's expected, not the one they actually believe. To mold themselves to what the system wants, even when it feels wrong. And this doesn't just affect the so-called troublemakers. Even high-achieving students are caught in the trap. Maybe especially them. They're the ones who learn to adapt perfectly, to meet expectations with a smile. But deep down, many of them feel the same emptiness, the same pressure to perform, the same fear of failure, not as an event, but as a loss of identity. Because when your value is based entirely on being the good student, who are you when you stop succeeding? The hidden curriculum is insidious because it's hard to point at. No one writes it down, no one admits it's being taught, but it shows up in how students are treated. Who gets listened to? What kind of curiosity is encouraged, and what kind is shut down? It's the difference between asking a question to understand and asking a question to challenge. One is praised, the other is punished. And perhaps most dangerously, the hidden curriculum teaches you to police yourself. Over time, the teacher doesn't need to silence you. You do it for them. You second-guess your instincts. You edit your ideas. You become your own censor. Because you've learned the most important rule of all: stay in line. But here's the twist. The world we're heading into doesn't need more rule followers. It needs thinkers, questioners, people who can navigate uncertainty, adapt with creativity, and challenge systems that no longer work. Yet we're still teaching students to memorize the old answers instead of cultivating new questions. So what would it look like to flip the script? Imagine a classroom where questioning is not punished, but prized, where students are invited to reflect on the rules themselves, not just follow them, where obedience is not confused with respect, and dissent is not mistaken for disrespect, where learning isn't about molding behavior, but awakening minds. This would require trust, real trust. It would mean letting go of some control, accepting a little more mess. But it would also mean something radical. Students growing up with the courage to speak their minds, challenge broken systems, and live according to truth, not fear. The hidden curriculum doesn't have to stay hidden. We can name it, unpack it, replace it. Because education should not be about conditioning people to fit into society as it is, but about empowering them to imagine society as it could be. And that, perhaps, is the most revolutionary lesson of all. Education doesn't have to be a trap. It can be a door if we dare to rebuild it. Imagine a system where learning is not about ranking people but revealing potential, where students aren't boxed in by syllabi, but invited into real conversations, where creativity isn't a weekend hobby, it's how we teach everything. Dewey imagined it, Illich demanded it. And maybe it's time we stop accepting education as it is and start reimagining it as it could be. Because in the end, we're not just teaching kids to pass tests, we're teaching them what life is. And if we teach them that life is rigid, controlled, and joyless, they might just believe us. But if we show them it can be curious, meaningful, and alive, maybe, just maybe, we can change the world by changing how we learn. If this video sparked something in you, don't let it fade. Share it. Comment with your own school experience. What did you learn that mattered, and what was missing? Subscribe for more honest, philosophical takes on modern systems and how we might rebuild them. Because education shouldn't be about memorizing, it should be about awakening. Let's start the conversation.